She took the job no one wanted at the rich, cruel Cowboy's ranch and lived her best days. The wind in Harmony Gulch carried more than dust. It carried warnings. For Clara, gaunt and running on the fumes of desperation, the tattered notice on the sheriff's board was a lifeline. Her fingers, raw from hunger, traced the crude letters. Blackwood Ranch. The name was a poison on the townsfolk's lips, a sprawling, lonely landscape that exuded isolation, quiet menace, and a deep, unspoken sorrow. Its owner, Gideon Blackwood, was a wealthy recluse, a certified bad egg whispered to be more beast than man. No one stayed long. Yet the ghosts Clara was outrunning were far more terrifying than any living monster. Survival was a game played one desperate bet at a time, and this was her last chip. Her jaw set a flicker of iron in her weary eyes. She wasn't just taking a job, she was walking into a gilded cage. But what she didn't know was this: sometimes the cruelest monster isn't the jailer, but the secret he's dying to protect. The wind in Harmony Gulch was a liar. It whispered of cool water over sun-scorched rock and rustled through the cottonwoods with a promise of life, but all it carried was dust. For Clara, it was the dust of a life ground down to nothing. It coated her cracked lips, settled in the hollows of her collarbones, and clung to the threadbare dress that was all she had left. She was a ghost, haunted by ghosts running on the fumes of a desperation so sharp it had become a kind of strength. And then she saw it. Nailed to the sheriff's board, a piece of paper so weathered it seemed part of the wood. Housekeeper wanted. Blackwood Ranch. Work is hard. Pay is high. No questions asked. She took a step closer, the single street falling into a hush around her. She could feel the town's eyes on her back, feel their pity curdling into fear on her behalf. "Thinking of trying your luck, girl?" a gravelly voice asked. Sheriff Miller stood in the doorway of his office, his face a roadmap of weary concern. "That's a fool's errand." "I'm out of luck," Sheriff Clara answered, her voice a dry rasp. "And errands. Some roads are best left unwalked," he warned, his gaze heavy. "Gideon Blackwood. He's a man wrestling with devils, and his ranch ain't no place for a lone woman. No one stays. They either run screaming in the night or they just disappear." He lowered his voice. "They say the place is cursed, that he's a certified bad egg meaner than a rattler in a heat wave." Clara looked from the sheriff's honest, worried face to the stark words on the paper. A curse. Devils. Disappearance. The warnings were clear as the unforgiving sun above. But the ghosts she was outrunning were far more terrifying than any living man. The memory of a broken promise and a life stolen from her was a fire at her heels. This wasn't a choice. It was the only door left standing in a world of ash. "A man's devils don't scare me," she said, the words tasting like a prayer and a lie. "I've seen enough of my own." She tore the notice from the board. The splintering sound was the only noise in the sudden dead silence of the street. The journey to Blackwood Ranch was a pilgrimage into isolation. The dusty track of the town gave way to a sprawling, lonely landscape, beautiful in its savage indifference. The mountains clawed at a sky of impossible blue, and the air grew thin and sharp, smelling of pine and cold stone. With every step, the world of men felt further away, a forgotten dream. The silence here was different. It wasn't empty. It was watchful. Finally, she saw it. The ranch was nestled in a valley, a magnificent scar on the face of the wilderness. The main house was a fortress of dark timber and river stone, grand and imposing, with windows that stared out like vacant eyes. It was perfect, unnervingly so. Not a fence post was out of place, not a weed marred the path. It was the kind of order born not of love, but of iron control. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. This was it. The last gamble. She raised a trembling hand and knocked on the massive oak door. The sound was swallowed by the immense silence. For a long moment nothing happened. Then the latch clicked with the sharp finality of a gunslinger's hammer. The door swung inward. He was taller than she'd imagined, his frame filling the doorway, blotting out the light. Gideon Blackwood was not the monster from the town's whispers, not in the way they meant. He was handsome, but it was a cruel beauty, his face carved from harsh lines and shadowed by a grief so profound it had frozen into something cold and hard. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held no welcome. Only a deep, chilling emptiness. Another stray blown in by the wind, he set his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. It was a dismissal. Clara lifted her chin, the flicker of iron returning to her soul. "My name is Clara. I'm here for the job." He looked her over, a long, dissecting gaze that stripped her down to her desperation and her defiance. A flicker of something surprise annoyance crossed his face before the mask of indifference slammed back into place. "The rules are simple," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You will tend to this house. You will not ask questions. You will not speak unless spoken to. And you will never, under any circumstances, enter the west wing of this house. That door remains shut. To you. To everyone." He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "Break these rules, and I will not send you away. I will throw you out into the wilderness myself. Are we clear?" Clara met his glacial stare, the ghosts of her past screaming at her to turn and run. But there was nowhere left to run. "Crystal," she whispered. He stepped back, leaving the doorway open. It was not an invitation, but a challenge. As she crossed the threshold, the great oak door swung shut behind her, the sound echoing through the cavernous hall like a tomb being sealed. The world she knew was gone. She had found her sanctuary, or she had just walked into the heart of the storm. Clara awoke to a silence so profound it felt like a weight on her chest. In her small Spartan room, the morning light cut a clean, sharp line across the floorboards, illuminating dancing dust motes in a world devoid of sound. There were no birds chirping near the house, no distant lowing of cattle, no human chatter. The silence was a living entity, the first and most loyal servant of Gideon Blackwood. It was his sentinel, his shield. The house itself was a beautiful tomb, filled with exquisite furniture draped in white cloths, portraits on the walls, with their eyes turned away, and floors polished to a mirror shine that reflected a lonely, empty sky. Her first day was a blur of back-breaking tasks. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles were raw, polished silver that had not seen a human touch in years, and dusted rooms that seemed to hold their breath, waiting for inhabitants who would never return. Her work was watched, she knew, not by a man, but by the house itself. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a judgment. In the cavernous kitchen, she met the ranch's only other indoor servant, a woman named Martha. She was old, with hands gnarled like ancient roots and eyes that held a deep, settled fear. She moved with a silent, shuffling gait, never looking up for more than a second. "He likes his coffee black, his bread fresh, his solitude absolute," Martha whispered, pushing a small loaf of bread and a piece of cheese toward Clara without meeting her gaze. "Do the work, child. Earn your pay. But don't go looking for answers in this house." She finally glanced up, her eyes pleading. "There are none worth finding." Before Clara could ask what she meant, the old woman had shuffled away, leaving another unanswered question hanging in the air. Was she a prisoner too? The real test came in the afternoon. Gideon had left a note on the kitchen table, the script sharp and severe as his voice. "The stables. Muck them out." The stables were as grand and empty as the house, the air thick with the scent of hay and horsehide. A lone stable hand, a stoic man with a heavily scarred face, nodded at her from a distance, but offered no words. And then she saw him. In the largest stall stood a stallion, a magnificent beast of midnight black, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian. But his eyes rolled wildly, white-rimmed with a terror that had curdled into pure rage. He kicked at the stall door, the sound a series of violent cracks that echoed the frantic beating of his heart. "Best stay clear of that one," Miss the stable hand finally spoke, his voice a low rasp. "That's Obsidian, the master's horse. Got a demon in him, that one. No one can get near him." Clara looked past the bared teeth and the stomping hooves. She didn't see a demon. She saw a pain that mirrored her own, the frantic, desperate fury of a trapped thing. The world had taught her that cornered creatures were the most dangerous and the most broken. Ignoring the stable hand's frantic gesture to stay back, she slowly approached the stall. She didn't carry a rope or a bridle. She simply stood just beyond his reach and began to hum. It was a low, wordless tune, a melody her mother used to sing, a song of quiet fields and gentle streams. It was the only thing of beauty she had left from her past. Obsidian froze. His ears twitched, swiveling toward the sound. The wild kicking stopped. His frantic breathing slowed. Clara kept humming, her voice a soft, steady current in the tense silence. She took another step, then another, until she could have reached out and touched him. He watched her, his great dark eyes filled not with rage anymore, but with a vast, weary curiosity. He was listening. A floorboard creaked in the hayloft above. Clara's head snapped up. Gideon stood there, half shrouded in shadow, his silhouette a slash of darkness against the light from the loft door. He had been watching. How long she didn't know. His face was unreadable, but the cold indifference was gone, replaced by something raw and shattered. It was a look of profound shock, as if she hadn't just calmed a wild horse, but had taken a ghost by the hand and led it out into the sun. Without a word, he turned and vanished back into the shadows. He left behind a silence more jarring than the stallion's rage. It was the silence of a wound being torn open. That night, exhaustion was a leaden weight in Clara's bones, but sleep wouldn't come. The house was a labyrinth of secrets, and she was trapped at its center. As the moon climbed high, casting silver light through her small window, she heard it. It came from the west wing, a sound so faint she almost thought she'd imagined it. It was a melodic, sorrowful humming, a broken lullaby that seemed to seep through the very stone of the house. It was achingly beautiful, yet filled with an unbearable loneliness. The sound rose and fell, a fragile thread of music in the oppressive dark. Then it was cut short by a sharp, heavy thud, and the suffocating silence rushed back in deeper and more absolute than before. Clara lay still, her blood frozen in her veins. The sheriff's words echoed in her mind. Devils! But that hadn't been the sound of a devil. It had been the sound of a broken heart. She was beginning to understand. The curse of Blackwood Ranch wasn't a demon. It was a memory, and the monster everyone feared was nothing more than a man standing guard over a grave. The morning after the incident in the stables, the silence of the house had changed. It was no longer empty. It was charged heavy with the weight of things seen and things left unsaid. Gideon Blackwood was no longer a phantom leaving notes. He was a physical presence, a storm cloud on the edge of Clara's world. He met her in the main hall as she polished the banister, his boots silent on the stone floor. "The rose garden," he said, his voice a low command that cut through the quiet. "It's been left to ruin. See to it." It was not a request. It was a test. The garden was a skeleton of its former self, a place of exquisite sorrow. Gnarled, thorny canes clawed at the air, their dead branches a testament to a long-neglected love. As Clara worked her hands, protected by thick gloves, she felt the ghost of this place. It was in the faint, sweet scent that still clung to the soil in the elegant layout of the withered beds. This had been someone's sanctuary. As she pruned a particularly vicious branch, she found it a small, faded silk ribbon the color of a summer sky tied carefully around a dead stem. It was brittle with age. She touched it gently, a pang of empathy echoing through her for the person who had tied it there. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement in an upstairs window, a silhouette in the dark glass. He was watching her. She did not look up. She simply untied the ribbon, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her pocket. Their paths began to cross with a startling deliberate frequency. He would appear as she dusted the silent library, his presence sucking the air from the room. He would stand at the far end of a long corridor as she carried linens, his form a study in stillness. One afternoon, as she hummed the same low tune she'd used to soothe Obsidian, his voice sliced through the air from his study door. "Must you make that noise?" Clara turned her hands still. She met his gaze, a sea of stormy gray. "Music soothes a troubled soul, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Man or beast." The words struck a chord. For a heartbeat, the anger in his eyes was replaced by a flash of raw, unfiltered pain. He said nothing more, simply turned and closed the door, but his silence was a wound. The delicate truce shattered late one night. A storm raged outside the wind, howling like a banshee, rattling the window panes. Worried a shutter had come loose, Clara patrolled the silent halls, a single candle her only companion. The door to his study was ajar. Light spilled out. She found him slumped over his massive desk, not with a bottle, but with his head in his hands, the picture of utter soul-crushing exhaustion. A heavy ledger lay open before him. From her angle, Clara could see columns of dates and figures and the words medical supplies and doctor's fees, Boston. The costs were astronomical, a king's ransom paid out month after month. For a moment the harsh lines of his face softened in the candlelight, and she saw not a cruel master, but a young man drowning under the weight of an impossible burden. An impulse she didn't understand moved her. She retreated to the hall, retrieved a heavy wool blanket from a chest, and returned. She draped it gently over his broad shoulders. His head shot up. His eyes, bleary with fatigue, blazed with a sudden wild fury. "Get out." "You'll catch a chill, sir," she said, refusing to be cowed by his anger. "I don't recall asking for your opinion." "Or your pity," he snarled, shrugging the blanket off as if it had burned him. Clara stood her ground, her small flame of courage holding steady against his gale of fury. "It is not pity," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Even iron must be allowed to cool, sir, or it will crack. You know nothing." He roared, rising to his feet, his shadow leaping up the walls like a giant. He stalked towards her, his face a mask of agony. "You know nothing of the promises a man makes to the dying, the debts he must pay." He stopped just before her, his chest heaving, the storm outside a mere echo of the tempest within him. He was close enough that she could see the profound sorrow that lay beneath the rage, a chasm of endless grief. He stared at her for a long, torturous moment, then his voice dropped to a ragged, broken whisper. "Leave me." She retreated, her heart pounding, backing out of the room and pulling the door softly closed. She leaned against the cool wood, her body trembling. A debt, a promise to the dying. Her gaze fell to the floor at her feet. There, glinting in the candlelight, lay a small object that must have fallen from his coat during his outburst. It was a silver locket tarnished with age and worn smooth from countless touches. It was small, delicate, and achingly personal. Her fingers closed around the cool metal. The urge to open it to see the face held within was an overwhelming, forbidden fire. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the answer to the broken lullaby, to the astronomical doctor's fees, to the ghost in the rose garden was resting in the palm of her hand. Clara stood in her room, the silver locket cold in her palm. She had not opened it. To do so felt like the ultimate trespass, a violation of the grief Gideon guarded so fiercely. Outside, the world was holding its breath. The sky had turned a bruised, sickly purple, and the wind had fallen into an unnerving silence. A single, perfect snowflake drifted down, then another heavy and deliberate as coins dropping into a wishing well. This was no gentle winter fall. It was an omen. Within the hour, the world vanished. The blizzard descended not as a storm but as a hungry white entity swallowing the mountains, the valley, and the ranch whole. The wind screamed a physical clawing force that tore at the house's sturdy timbers. It was a storm of biblical proportions, a force of nature intent on burying Blackwood Ranch and all its secrets under a shroud of white. A thunderous crack echoed from the direction of the stables, sharp enough to cut through the howl of the wind. The horses. Obsidian. Clara flew from her room, nearly colliding with Gideon as he burst from his study, his face a mask of grim urgency. He was already pulling on a heavy sheepskin coat. "Stay inside," he yelled over the roar, his voice a whip crack. "That's an order." But Clara saw the flash of terror in his eyes, the fear of losing one more thing he loved. Her own fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but the thought of those animals trapped and panicked was stronger. "They will kill each other in their panic," she shouted back, grabbing her own thin coat. "I can calm them." For a heartbeat they stood in defiance, a silent, furious battle of wills against the backdrop of the screaming wind. He saw the iron in her spine, the unwavering resolve in her eyes. It was the same look she'd had the day she arrived, but now it was not born of desperation. It was born of courage. He gave a sharp, reluctant nod. The world outside the door was a maelstrom of blinding white. The cold was a physical blow, stealing their breath. They fought their way to the stables, two small, solitary figures against the fury of the world moving in a silent, desperate rhythm. A heavy beam in the stable roof had splintered, sagging ominously under the impossible weight of the snow. The horses, including Obsidian, screamed in their stalls, their eyes wild. They worked without words. Gideon, with brute strength, began reinforcing the beam with a spare post, his muscles straining. Clara moved from stall to stall, her voice a low, steady current of calm, her hands gentle on the trembling animals. She reached Obsidian's stall last. He was crashing against the walls, but the moment he saw her, he stilled his panicked breaths, turning to great, shuddering snorts. She pressed her forehead to his whispering promises into the storm. As they finally led the last of the horses to the relative safety of the lower barn, a sound tore through the blizzard, a noise that was not the wind. It was a cataclysmic crack of splitting timber, followed by the high, shattering symphony of glass. It came from the house. They stumbled back inside, snow and ice clinging to them. The long, dark corridor leading to the west wing was a disaster. A colossal pine tree, defeated by the storm, had fallen against the house, its branches having punched through the tall, arched windows like angry fists. And the forbidden door, its heavy lock shattered by the impact, hung wide open. A dark, gaping mouth breathing cold dread into the house. From the darkness within, a low, terrified whimper echoed the sound of a small animal caught in a trap. Gideon froze, the color draining from his face. All the strength, all the fury vanished from his body, leaving him utterly, terrifyingly vulnerable. A figure stumbled out of the blackness, silhouetted against the swirling snow from the broken windows. It was a young woman, perhaps 16, clad in a simple white nightdress. Her hair was a wild tangle, her limbs thin and fragile. But it was her eyes that seized Clara's heart. They were Gideon's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, but they were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to have no bottom. She moved with a frantic, uncoordinated grace, her hands pressed over her ears, trying to block out the sensory hell of the storm. This was no devil. This was no monster. This was a child. Lilia Gideon breathed. The name was not a word. It was a prayer. It was a wound. He took a slow step towards her, his hands raised in a gesture of helpless, gentle surrender. The cruel rancher, the tyrant of Blackwood, was gone. In his place was only a brother, his face a ruin of love and despair. Clara's hand instinctively went to her pocket, her fingers closing around the locket. She finally understood. The curse, the secrets, the crushing weight on his soul. She wasn't looking at a monster. She was looking at the promise he had made to the dying. And in that moment she felt no fear, only a wave of profound, heart-stopping empathy that threatened to sweep her away. The storm raged inside and out. Lilia stood amidst the wreckage of the corridor, a fragile ghost in a whirlwind of snow and shattered glass, her whimpers lost in the wind's deafening scream. Gideon, his face a mask of raw panic, took a step towards her, his hands outstretched. "Lilia, please." He begged, his voice cracking, stripped of all its authority. "It's just me. It's Gideon. Come back inside. It's all right." But his desperate words were just more noise in the sensory hell that had consumed her. She flinched away from him, a terrified animal, pressing herself back against the broken wall, her eyes darting between her brother and the violent white chaos outside. "Don't just stand there," Gideon roared at Clara, his fear lashing out. "Help me. We have to get her back to her room before she freezes." He saw a problem to be contained, a disaster to be managed. But Clara saw a soul drowning in sound. She saw the same terror that had been in Obsidian's eyes, the same frantic need for an anchor in a world that had become a nightmare. And she knew that his approach, born of love and desperation, was all wrong. He was building the walls of her panic higher with every frantic plea. Ignoring his command, Clara took a slow, deliberate step into the ruined corridor, placing herself between Lilia and the worst of the swirling snow. She did not look at Gideon. She looked only at the terrified girl, and she began to hum. It was the broken lullaby from the night before, a melody of profound sadness and gentle beauty. Her voice was a fragile thread of warmth against the storm's icy rage, a single, steady note in a world of screaming chaos. "What are you doing?" Gideon's voice was a horrified whisper. "Stop it. You'll scare her. Stay away from her." But Clara didn't stop. She stood her ground, her body a shield against the wind, her voice a lifeline. She poured all the empathy, all the quiet understanding of her own broken past into that simple, wordless song. Lilia froze. Her frantic, darting gaze stilled. Her head tilted, her ears straining to catch the sound, to isolate it from the roar. The terror in her eyes, that vast, bottomless ocean of fear, began to recede, replaced by a flicker of intense, focused curiosity. She was listening. The song was cutting through the storm. Clara took another small step, never breaking the melody. Lilia watched her breathing still ragged, but the wild panic was gone. She took a hesitant step of her own, not back towards the prison of her room, but away from the wall towards the song, towards Clara. It was in that moment that Gideon finally broke. He slid down the wall, his strength utterly deserting him, and buried his face in his hands. A sound tore from his throat, a ragged, choked sob of a man who had carried an impossible weight alone for far too long. The dam of his grief, built over years with stones of cruelty and mortar of solitude, finally crumbled. He wept for his sister, for the promise he'd made, for the years of failed, desperate love. He wept because for the first time someone else saw the beautiful, terrified girl behind the phantom of the family curse. As the blizzard's fury began to wane outside, so did the tempest in the house. The sun, a pale, watery disk, finally broke through the clouds, casting long, fragile fingers of light into the wrecked corridor. In that quiet, exhausted dawn, Clara gently led a calm, shivering Lilia to a chair by the hearth, wrapping her in the wool blanket Gideon had shrugged off. Hours later, Clara was sitting by the fire, watching Lilia sleep peacefully on a nearby sofa. The house was still the silence now, a gentle, healing thing. Gideon appeared in the doorway. His eyes were red-rimmed and raw, stripped bare of every defense. He looked at his sleeping sister, then at Clara, and his expression was one of awe, of gratitude, of a surrender so complete it was a kind of rebirth. He walked over to her, his steps heavy with the exhaustion of 100 sleepless nights. He stopped before her and slowly, deliberately held out his hand. Resting in his palm was the small silver locket. He did not speak. He just offered it to her. It was not a gift. It was a confession. It was an apology. It was an act of absolute trust. It was the key to everything. In the quiet hours after the storm, with the house wrapped in a blanket of peaceful exhaustion, Clara sat by the fire and finally opened the silver locket. The hinges gave a soft click, a sound like a key turning in a long-forgotten lock. Inside were 2 miniature portraits painted with an exquisite loving detail. On one side was a woman with Lilia's stormy eyes and a smile that promised warmth and kindness. Their mother. On the other was a much younger Gideon, his arm thrown around a smiling, healthy Lilia. His face was unguarded, his eyes bright, with a light Clara had never seen a light unburdened by grief or duty. It was the face of a boy who believed the world was good. It was the last remnant of the man he was before he'd had to build a monster to protect what he loved. Seeing it was like looking at the sun before it had been swallowed by a long, terrible eclipse. The days that followed were a slow, gentle thaw. The sun, brilliant and new, melted the snow, and the sound of dripping water from the eaves was a soft, healing percussion. The oppressive silence of Blackwood Ranch was broken, replaced by the quiet sounds of life. The staff, their fear washed away with the storm, spoke in low, respectful tones. Martha would bring Clara tea, her eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. The scarred stable hand would tip his hat, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. Clara's work was no longer a set of tasks, but a gentle rhythm of care. She and Lilia spent hours in the ravaged rose garden. Clara showed her how to prune the deadwood, how to nurture the resilient stems that had survived. Lilia, in turn, showed Clara the world through her eyes, a world of intense color and quiet wonder. She would trace the delicate veins on a new leaf, her face a study in serene concentration. She began to hum again, not the broken, sorrowful tune from the darkness, but the full, sweet lullaby, a melody of peace. Gideon changed most of all. The harshness fell away from him like a shattered stone, revealing the raw, vulnerable man beneath. He began to work alongside them, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he cleared debris or reinforced a trellis. One evening, as a sunset of impossible beauty painted the valley in the strokes of gold and rose, he found Clara on the porch. He stood beside her, not speaking for a long time, the silence between them now comfortable, a shared space of understanding. Her name was Elspeth, he said finally, his voice low. My mother. She was a healer, knew every root and herb in this valley. When the fever came through, she saved half the town. He paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon. But she couldn't save everyone. Fear is a worse sickness than any fever. They started whispering. Witch, devil woman. One night, they came with torches. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. But Clara could feel the tremor of that old, unbearable pain. She died because she was different, because they were afraid. Lilia. She has her mother's sensitivity. She sees the world differently. I promised my mother on her deathbed that I would never let the world break her like it broke her, that I would protect her at any cost. He finally looked at Clara, his eyes a sea of regret. So, I built a fortress to keep the world out, and I didn't realize until you came that it had become a prison for us all. Clara thought of her own past, of being cast out of the loneliness that had been her only companion. She reached out her fingers, gently touching his arm. You kept your promise, Gideon. You kept her safe. Now, you don't have to do it alone. He covered her hand with his own, his touch warm and sure. The ranch was no longer a place of sorrow. It was becoming a sanctuary. Gideon, with Clara's guidance, began to make plans not to hide Lilia, but to build a world where she could flourish. The doors to the west wing were thrown open, light and air flooding the once darkened rooms. He turned to her, a rare, quiet smile touching his lips. I thought this ranch was the end of my life, the place where everything good came to die. He looked into her eyes, and she saw not a storm, but a clear, endless sky. But you walked into the heart of the curse and made it the beginning. Clara looked out at the peaceful valley, at Lilia, who was gently touching a newly opened rosebud, her face illuminated in the golden light. She looked at the strong, gentle man standing beside her, his hand holding hers. The ghosts of her past were finally silent. The job no one wanted had given her everything she had ever lost and everything she had never dared to dream of. This was not an ending. It was a home. These were, she knew with a certainty that filled her soul, the very best days of her life.